And it turns out that, once again, 60% of the first generation Canadians had no idea what that symbol meant. So I guess really kind of the purpose of why I'm showing you this and admitting this terribly embarrassing life story is that sustainability does not have a universal language. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later as it pertains to package labeling. So consumers are great environmentalists when you ask them. So there are greater stated levels of concern for the environment, more than at any point in the past 20 years. So when you ask people, do you care about the environment? They're saying yes, more so than any point in the past 2 decades. Consumers express a preference to purchase products deemed to be more environmentally stable and safe. Consumers are more engaged, informed, and interested in environmental issues and products than ever before. And the question is, does this increase in environmental concern translate into changes in consumer behavior? So people are saying they're going to do all this stuff, but are they actually doing it? And the answer is yes and no. There is still a significant disconnect between what people say they will do and what they will actually do. So an example of this is that, once again, most people say that they'd be willing to pay more for a greener product. Some of you may be aware that McKinsey released a consulting report. McKinsey is one of the world's largest consulting companies, and they said that consumers are willing to vote with their dollars when it comes to sustainability. But overwhelmingly, the academic research on that topic, when it comes to observed behavior, shows that consumers actually aren't willing to do this. And this disconnect between intent and action is known as the value action gap. So people don't do what they say they're going to do. So what is the value action gap and why does it matter? Well, self-reported behaviors and stated intentions must be taken with a huge grain of salt. How you administer the survey, where you administer the survey, etc. are all factors that could skew the results. I've spent the better part of 18 years conducting consumer-based surveys and studies, and even I tell people, don't trust what you find in my own research, because once again, it relies on self-reported behaviors. And in self-reported behaviors, people have a propensity to overstate their participation in socially altruistic activities like recycling, like sustainability, etc. So what's really interesting is that when we talk about, the value action gap and how people think about or how does people actions align with their internal value systems, we have to first understand the different types of behaviors. We have 3 types. There's transient behavior, there's planned behavior, and there's habitual behavior. And depending on what behavior or modality that you're in, it will fundamentally change the way you think about the purchase or what you ultimately end up doing when it comes to actually deciding on a purchase. So transient decision making occurs when a consumer makes an unexpected or impromptu purchasing decision. These decisions are often triggered by external stimuli such as promotional offers, attractive displays, or impulse buys. Transient decisions are typically made quickly with little or no prior research or consideration. And so an example would be like purchasing a snack at the checkout counter or buying a heavily discounted item on a whim. Planned decision making, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of that. So it involves a much more deliberate and structured approach to purchasing. Consumers engage in this type of decision making when they have a specific need or goal in mind and actively seek out information to make an informed choice. So planned decisions often involve higher priced or more complex products, such as electronics, appliances, or vacations. The decision-making process may include researching options, comparing features and prices, reading reviews, and consulting with others before making a final decision. Lastly, we have habitual decision-making, which occurs when consumers make purchases based on established routines or brand loyalty. These decisions are often automatic and require little conscious thought or effort. Habitual purchases are typically low involvement products that are bought frequently. So think of your groceries, you know. Habitual decision making basically helps simplify the purchasing process and reduces the cognitive effort required to make a choice. So when I go to the store, I have a very good idea of what it is that I want, and I'm not necessarily engaging in self-introspection when it comes to what I put in my cart, which is one of the reasons why surveys are not necessarily a good proxy of actual behavior. And actually, I'll take a step back and actually even kind of ask you guys, if I ask you, are you willing to pay more for a sustainable product? Most likely, you'll reflect on your own personal value system, you'll take into consideration your economic circumstances, and you'll probably make a decision that says, you know, if you're able to do so, and it's in accordance with your values, that yes, you would spend more. But when you think about decision making in a grocery store, none of that happens. So when you ask a question in a survey setting, it's fundamentally removed from kind of what's the term we use in academic parlance is the modality of behavior. So that's why that even though people genuinely mean it when they say that they'd be willing to pay more for a sustainable product or they're willing to act more sustainably, that in a real world setting it doesn't match up. And so habitual purchases, which make up most of our purchases, involve very little cognitive or conscious thought. And so I don't know if you guys can actually make out the numbers on this chart, or if you can hear me over this horrible background sound. Only 10% of purchases fall under planned decision making. So think about all the stuff that we buy, only 10% of it that we're actually going to engage in research, read reviews, etc. 90% falls into either transient decision making or habitual decision making. And how long do you think the average person spends thinking about a product prior to purchasing it? Is it 0.5 seconds, 0.9 seconds, 2.3 seconds, 4 seconds, or more than 5 seconds? Anybody want to take a guess? 5 seconds? It's 0.9 seconds. So this is when it comes to purchasing in a grocery store, or so obviously these numbers can be skewed depending on the environment and the product. This study was done with grocery shopping in mind, and so the average person only spends 0.9 seconds reflecting on what it is that they're willing to buy. So now I kind of want to delve into label reading habits, and the whole reason why I kind of gave you this explanation about transient versus planned decision making is that there's a big emphasis and a lot of momentum by packaging producers to now put sustainable package labeling on their products. And the idea is that it can help consumers make more informed choices. Unfortunately, as we'll quickly see, people aren't necessarily willing to undertake that additional effort of reading the package label or using smart labeling technology to really kind of take advantage of that. So these survey results indicate, and by the way, these surveys are based on a study conducted in Ontario, Canada. It was with more than 1,000 consumers in the Greater Toronto area, and I should probably say that these types of responses in terms of purchasing habits tend to be a function of locality, so this may not be indicative of what would occur in your jurisdiction. So keep in mind that this study was conducted in a Canadian market with Canadian conditions and may not be representative of your particular jurisdiction. So when asked how often people read labels, only 19% of respondents indicated that they read labels frequently, while more than 53% of respondents said that they rarely or never read labels while shopping. This variance in reported label reading habits may be influenced by factors like product type and familiarity. Consumers may be more likely to check labels diligently when purchasing a new or high-risk product versus making a habitual purchase. Less than 7% of respondents looking at package labels for information pertaining to sustainability or recycling That was phrased kind of awkwardly, but basically, out of all the people that read labels, only 7% of them do so with sustainability in mind. These results highlight room for improvement in label utilization among shoppers. Increased consumer education on interpreting and applying labeling details could lead to more informed purchasing decisions that account for sustainability impacts. So when it comes to label reading habits, continued, like what are the drivers of it? There are several factors that are likely to influence label reading habits amongst consumers. These include product familiarity. Consumers pay less attention to labels when buying habitual, frequently purchased products. Risk perception. Shoppers are more inclined to read labels thoroughly when purchasing high-risk products, as noted earlier. Time constraints. Busy shoppers rushing to complete purchases may overlook labels if they perceive it to be as too time-consuming. Label visibility. Small, obscure label placement on packaging makes information easier to miss. This would suggest that clear, prominent labels are more likely to capture attention, but for anybody who works in the packaging space knows that every inch of the surface of a package matters, and sometimes you can't just put a large sustainability label on it because so much of that other packaging surface area is precious and could include other information. Lastly, there's consumer education. Many shoppers lack knowledge on how to interpret labeling details and apply them to sustainability considerations. So the survey results that you see up here indicate that while consumers have a strong desire for legitimacy and accuracy when making for package labeling claims, package labeling ultimately has a negligible impact on purchasing habits, preferences, and decision making. When asked directly about label influence, only about half of respondents said it was very important that companies provide accurate sustainability information for their packaging. However, when asked whether they're likely to change their purchasing habits to support companies that made accurate and sustainable claims, more than 45% disagreed. So once again, while people may have a desire, at least a moderate desire, for sustainable information on their packaging and accurate sustainability information on their packaging, that it has a negligible impact on their purchasing decisions. What's interesting is that when you look at the first graph, would you be more likely to purchase a product if its sustainability claims were easy to understand and verify? More than 50% of respondents said yes. This directly contradicts and contravenes the previous findings, and this once again highlights kind of the deficiencies of surveys. Depending on how you phrase a question, you may end up with a very different result. So this should be noted as kind of, once again, that huge heaping grain of salt I noted earlier, that you can't always trust surveys and what they say, and it's actually one of the reasons why we often ask the same questions multiple times, just phrased slightly differently, to ensure consistency of responses. In this particular instance, we actually noted that it was very inconsistent, and therefore, once again, we kind of have to interpret these results with caution. But overwhelmingly, I would say that people are not going to be willing to pay more for sustainable package labeling. It's something that is a nice to have, it's useful, but not at this juncture, it's not necessarily going to be driving consumer behavior or altering consumer decision making. So once again, these results, for the purposes of brevity, I don't want to repeat myself, but essentially people want verifiable sustainability claims. They think that there should be regulation and oversight for sustainability claims made on product packaging. But when it comes to whether people are actually willing to seek out information for themselves, and so what I mean by that, are they willing to contact companies to verify sustainable packaging information? They're unlikely to do so. So people want companies to be more responsible. They want government to impose that responsibility onto companies, but consumers in and of themselves are not necessarily willing to seek out that information themselves. Oh, and one last point on that final slide was that consumers rank greenwashing as a significant concern, and a significant percentage of respondents indicated feeling distrust or skepticism with respect to product sustainability claims. And I want to take a brief tangent, or go on a brief tangent rather, that there's a significant reputational risk to making false or misleading claims about sustainability. Some of you may be familiar with Keurig and their recyclable K-Cup, or their supposedly recyclable K-Cup. They made a commercial that said, as easy to recycle as it is to enjoy. What they didn't tell people was that it could only be recycled in one facility in all of North America and required highly specialized technology to do so. So when people originally embraced the K-Cup, they celebrated the fact that they could enjoy something and they felt they were making an environmentally responsible decision. But when the information came to light that it couldn't be recycled, Keurig's reputation was absolutely ruined in the North American market, so much so that actually they faced a $10 million fine by the Canadian Better Business Bureau for making false and misleading claims. And so increasingly we're starting to see more regulatory intervention when it comes to companies making false or misleading statements, and there's significant consumer backlash when companies are kind of caught doing so. So, you know, I think if there is a takeaway from all of this is that yes, customers care, and they're willing to hold companies accountable when they make false or inaccurate claims. So consumers' desire for accurate or verifiable sustainability claims is rooted in increased environmental consciousness. So consumers are more attuned to ecological impacts of products and production than really any time prior. They expect packaging to reflect this responsibility. There is a lack of current oversight. With limited regulation, misleading claims can proliferate. So consumers want stricter standards that are sought to ensure accuracy. There's a lot of confusing terminology. So terms like natural or green on packages can mean different things to different companies in different contexts. So there's increasing pressure across North America to have uniform standards and definitions regarding sustainability terminology. So what does natural mean? What does green mean? What does recyclable mean? Fun fact, the definition of recycling varies between every single province in Canada. What we count as recycled in Ontario is not the same metric that we use in BC. So as long, and just once again, this is more of an anecdote, if you can collect something and bale something, it's counted as recycled. It doesn't matter whether somebody buys it, doesn't matter whether it gets turned into a new product. That's our measurement of recycling in Ontario. But there is a national push from a regulatory perspective to standardize these definitions. So when it comes to consumer knowledge about labeling, you know, only 8% of respondents said that they were very familiar with the different types of sustainability claims and information that companies include on packaging. More than 40% of respondents said they were not familiar with sustainability claims that were being referenced, what the source of the information was, and whether that information was credible. And less than 10% of respondents indicated that they felt very informed or knowledgeable about labeling practices, terminologies, and impacts. So the following graph, which might be a little bit difficult to follow, and if you were in our first keynote of the day, you may have seen this. This graph was to measure consumer levels of awareness regarding specific terms. Out of all of the terms tested, only 3 had acknowledgement scores or awareness scores above 50%. So that was recycling, reuse, and composting. For things like circular economy, only 20% of people felt that they had a strong knowledge of what that meant. The same can be said of other terms like zero waste, waste to energy, life cycle impacts. And so a lot of the terms that we use, not only in the sustainability lexicon, but the terms that we're using on sustainable package labeling are completely outside of the domain of what the average person is familiar with. And so it's really critical that when we think about what do we communicate to the public in sustainable packaging design, what information do we want to share with them, we have to recognize that their level of awareness and knowledge is extremely limited. I would ask a pop quiz, but the room is kind of small, and so I'm going to ignore it. But, you know, just in case, for those of you who want to think about it, can you tell the difference between diversion and recycling? Can you provide an example of more than one GHG impact? And do you know what a composite material is? And subsequently, what makes composite materials very difficult to recycle? So when it comes to barriers to labeling comprehension, there are several. One is complexity of standards, the diversity of labeling schemes, fair trade, organic, VOC-free, etc., creates confusion and meaning with respect to verification. There's very vague terminology. There's information overload. With exhaustive product details, sustainability labels can get overlooked. Relevant info gets lost amidst other marketing. There's consumer education. Most people lack training on how to read and leverage sustainability metrics effectively when shopping. And then there's perceived trade-offs. Some consumers may avoid researching labels closely to avoid complicating or compromising purchasing priorities. One of the phenomenons that you might be familiar with is smart labeling technology, and I call it not so smart. That's when you have an app on your phone and you scan a QR code and you get all this wonderful information about sustainability metrics. For kind of the reasons I discussed earlier, when you're in grocery shopping mode, you're unlikely to pull out your cell phone, take the time to scan a package to seek out additional information. Using data from, once again, Southern Ontario, which is very demographically diverse. There's numerous language barriers, technical barriers to people accessing smartphone technology. They don't know how to use a QR code system, and what ultimately happens is that it creates a tiered level of environmentalism where only those who are native English speakers who have access to smart technology are able to leverage this type of information. And we also have to remember that convenience is the most significant predictor of success, and a smart labeling technology is adding an additional step in the purchasing process, which, unless you're a very actively engaged consumer or you have a specific reason for seeking out this information, the average person is not likely to do so. And there's actually a significant body of academic literature kind of proving this point, that when it comes to certain types of products, namely grocery products or fast goods consumables, smart labeling technology doesn't make any sense. It makes sense for luxury goods, so makeups, perfumes, etc. For products that might fall under the planned purchasing category list, smart technology or smart packaging technology might make a lot more sense, but nobody's going to be scanning their avocado or banana with their phone to determine whether it's sustainable or not. I don't know how much time I have left. The timer doesn't appear to be working. 15 minutes. Okay. Best practices, for brands and companies. What's really important is that brands should increase transparency of sustainability claims through additional details, third-party certification to match consumer demand for more voluntary sustainability verifiable claims. Companies also need to educate the public more on sustainability practices and what different label claims mean through awareness campaigns and marketing communication. This is identified as a best practice, but we also have to be cognizant that companies have limited ability to educate and inform consumers, particularly in diverse urban areas. So this is a nice to have, but not necessarily something that's a guaranteed success. Businesses should also work with retailers to have prominently displayed.
I'm not going to say which exhibitor it was, had their company certified and their products certified for sustainability, did not want to make any announcements on sustainability for fear of miscommunicating or any kind of backlash due to misunderstanding. So it just said, that's a given, and we're not communicating anything about it. So between doing that and getting it slightly wrong, which of the two would you choose? Which is the less of two evils, put it that way?
That's interesting. I think it highlights that one bad apple spoils the bunch. It's like you have one person lie, and suddenly it subverts the credibility of all actors, so much so that somebody might be ambivalent to disclose that they've undergone certification. But in my personal opinion, I think it's better to show what you've achieved and show what you've done than to hide it away.
But there's so much criticism of greenwashing
I think,
which I mean is,
I think
really is,
you know, it's very much, I guess, dependent on what type of certification, the industry, the sector.
Yeah.
So like I can't speak for the printing sector in terms of what certifications exist and how much credibility stands behind them. But in other industries, I think that you only, like for example, you might only have 3 or 4 prominent actors, and it's a lot easier to identify this is like an industry standard, this is a good one. So I don't doubt that that skepticism exists, but I think it's very much product or industry specific, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I can't comment on the issues with the printing sector.
Yeah, it wasn't it's a slightly vague example, but yeah, the question was better to withhold any communication or risk getting slightly wrong.
I say risk it.
Risk it. Oh, interesting. Okay, I would have thought you'd say withhold it. Okay. Another question? Yeah? It's nice and quiet now. We can hear you.
Yeah. Cal, as we were working on some other discussions earlier, since we know each other, I think one thing that I'd love for you to also share with the audience is when people are buying into voluntary schemes that actually become impossible. And you told me 2 or 3 weeks ago, as we were talking about that, like when people start trying to get some kind of recognition or buy into a paid scheme that they're not going to be able to do, what's your advice there?
So I would say that don't commit to something that you can't deliver on. So the idea of voluntarily entering into, say, compliance, and I think the example, just for so everybody can know, that we were discussing earlier was kind of like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and their commitment to reach 100% recyclable and or compostable goods or packaging by the year 2025. You had so many companies and organizations and even nation states join this commitment voluntarily, and it's going to blow up in their face because there's no chance of them meeting it. So I think that my personal opinion is that when it comes to some of these voluntary initiatives, you have to be pragmatic and realistic about what it is that they're trying to achieve. I'm not saying all voluntary initiatives are negative, but I think that it's important that should a company or entity enter into a voluntary scheme, that the scheme is not committing or promising something that doesn't seem feasible for that specific industry or sector. So yeah, my suggestions there would be don't promise something you can't deliver on, or don't commit to something that you can't deliver on.
Okay, thank you. Could you give us an example of good communication on labeling?
Ooh, that's a good question. So within the context of food-based packaging, which is kind of like the world I come from, I don't think there's many good examples. Because, for example, they'll say this package saves 10 liters of water and abates 300 grams of carbon. That means nothing to anybody, right? What I think you do see some better metrics is that in some of the smart labeling technologies, but for things like cars or luxury goods, it gives a much more comprehensive profile of what the sustainability impacts are. And they still run the risk of providing information that the average person may not fully utilize. But I think they do slightly better. But when it comes to sustainable packaging, like especially on-label declarations, there's only a finite amount of space to communicate a very complex topic. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think I've seen one that's done a particularly successful job. My mind is circling through and I can't think of one.
Okay.
I'm a big pessimist though, so don't listen. I may not be the best example.
Well, on that note, our next session is Key Factors for Compliance of Printed Food Contact Materials. That will be starting at 3. Thank you so much, Dr. Calvin Lacan, for coming to the Drupa Q. Round of applause. Thank you for your attention, and we'd love to get your feedback on this session, a brief survey with some multiple choice answers that you could fill in for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.